Werther is an exciting work. The story itself by Goethe was one of the most influential pieces of literature ever written, and we're still feeling it today. The creation of this flawed, tragic hero is still with us in books, in literature, on stage. I have to say, even Edward in Twilight is kind of a Werther kind of character, except that he's dead already. But I'm bummed, right? But nonetheless, Werther is really one of the most copied kinds of heroes throughout all of opera. So it's a real pleasure to do this opera. It takes an incredible cast to put it together. I personally, I've never done a Werther, and I've done a lot of opera repertoire, but I've never done a Werther, so I'm very excited to see it. I'm very late in coming to it. I've seen a lot of productions of it, and it never really worked for me. And then finally, about 6 years ago, I saw a production in Vienna, which suddenly the lights came on. I went, this is one of the greatest pieces ever written. So we waited until we felt like we had the right ingredients, and we think we have a perfect couple to do Werther, because quite honestly, that's really the show, is Werther and Charlotte. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome back James Valenti. And equally a great pleasure is to partner him with Roxana Constantinescu, who you all remember from our production of Cenerentola last year. And I was thinking yesterday, because I first heard Roxana in Vienna that same year, actually, and this was the first thing that she sang for me, and so it's always been kind of in the back of my mind that we should do this piece, and I think we have the right people. Now, we also have another tenor who is debuting with us, Nathaniel Peake, who is going to do one performance of Werther, and then he's going to grow to love Minnesota winters, although it's pretty wimpy this year, because he's staying on to do some performances of Lucia. And I have to say, it's also really exciting to work with Jessica Jahn, who has designed the costumes. We've done so many great things with Jessica, and it's so nice to always have her back. She brings such a great aura to it. And the set design is by Alan Moyer, who's done tons of stuff. And those of you who know some of our past productions, you may see some things from our former productions in this opera as well. And DM Wood is the lighting designer. I'm really pleased to welcome, debuting with us, is Maestro Campestrini, and I'd like to welcome him and ask him to come talk a little bit about his approach to Werther. Maestro Campestrini.
Hello everybody, it's a big pleasure for me being here for the first time, as you say. I'm hugely excited and looking forward to doing this production with everybody involved. Werther obviously is a very special opera for many reasons. You mentioned the background in literature and in the music, the same special color that was established in the words found its expression in the score. And I would like just to mention a few things that from a purely musical point of view I'd like to work on in the next few weeks together. As it is the case with the French language in general, I think it's going to be a great challenge for us to find a very flexible approach to this. In other words, you know, when a composer writes down notes and rhythms, it's always an approximation. In this case, an approximation to the language. And it is then up to us to recreate that speech, that sung speech, in a way that is not just like a metronome, of course, but that reflects not only the language, but also the dramatic impact of each phrase. And I'm very much looking forward to working with Kevin on this. For me, it's the most rewarding experience from a musical point of view in opera to work on each scene from the dramatic point and from the musical point, then get it together and try to find a solution that works for both. And the impact of any scene in opera, actually, if it's supported by what happens on the stage and the pit, is I think something that cannot be achieved in any other art form. Of course, getting together with the costumes and the lighting and all of this. So for me, that is something I would like to stress. Also, opera is very much a community effort of many aspects coming together, and I feel very privileged and happy to be part of this family of getting this wonderful opera on stage together. I would also like to say a few things about this opera in particular, just from a point of view of the score. Massenet said once himself that for him the orchestration is as much a part of this opera in the character of a protagonist as the words. So that means that the colors that we find in this score are amazing, and they're also part of the concept of a composer. And for us in the cast, I think it will be a wonderful opportunity to find a reflection of all these colors in the instruments, also in the vocal approach to it. If you look at this from a purely instrumental point of view, the score, the orchestral parts, it's easy to notice that there's a huge focus, emphasis on lower instruments, for instance, lower woodwinds such as clarinets, bassoons, trombones, to express the gloomy atmosphere of Werther. And when we have passages, vocal passages that go with that, I will try to find a color that relates to that and makes it unified. The other thing I would like to mention in this opera that plays a huge role for me is the contrast, the dramatic contrast between the couple with all the tragedy and the doom at the end, and on the other hand, the comic characters. Because Massenet, of course, was a hugely theatrical person, and he realized that it's impossible for an audience to sustain for 2.5 hours just tragedy, death, and suicide, and so on. I mean, no, this is, yeah. Right. As a matter of fact, even to counter emphasize that, to make more of a contrast in that, he introduced all these comic figures. And we haven't talked about this, Kevin, but I think there are wonderful opportunities to show the extreme difference in approach. Something else that I find plays a huge role in that opera is the concept of the artist as embodied by Werther, the poet, somebody who thinks in of freedom, of nature. Also, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course, was a big influence on Massenet in that way of thinking. And on the other hand, the bourgeoisie, the established society embodied in many ways by Albert, and also Charlotte being in between that, because I feel that is one of the big contrasts and a dilemma really for her, where to place herself, and all these things that, for instance, that artistic longing for independence. I came here from Europe yesterday on the flight, and I had with me the original Goethe, also the Leiden, this Jung Werther, and I found amazing correspondences between some of the letters that are not in the opera, because it's obvious that a lot of the words were then by the three librettists transferred into the opera and made part of love this. But there was an article that I read about Massenet where he said also the letters that he didn't use made a big impact on his concept of the figures. So you see, there are many things to talk about, to explore. I just wanted to mention a few little details. I don't want to get too long. We have many weeks ahead of us to talk about this anyway. I just would like to tell you again how wonderfully excited I am to be here, what a privilege it is for me to be a guest in your city, and I look forward to working with you the next few weeks. Thank you.
Maestro Campestrini will be assisted also by Dale Cruz, who is conducting the children's chorus. We don't have an adult chorus in Werther, but we have kids. Dale. And finally, it's also a great pleasure. I mean, he might as well have a second home here in Minnesota, since he directs here all the time. And he will be directing here twice next year. We just can't get enough of him. He's doing Anna Bolena next year and Doubt. And I am really pleased and thrilled to welcome back Kevin Newbury.
Hey everybody, nice to see you guys. I say this every time I'm here. It's like coming home every time I'm in Minneapolis. And St. Paul, don't forget about St. Paul, right? I always get in trouble by saying Minneapolis and not St. Paul. Although this is my third January in a row here, and I've been sharing... But I've been sharing war stories about how freezing it is here, and now it's actually warmer than New York, so I feel like I have to take some of that back. Anyway, in a story about obsession, it's funny because I've become sort of obsessed with Werther over the last year and a half putting this show together. And just to kind of reiterate some of the things that Maestro and Dale were saying, that this iconic figure of Werther kind of haunts our collective imagination right now. And for me, he's always felt like somebody that time left behind, a man that time just sort of passed by, because he is sort of the prototype for the romantic, suffering hero, kind of like Lenski and Onegin, Lord Byron, Edward the Vampire also. I think it's a very good reference. And so in thinking about how to approach this piece, I always ask myself, okay, when was it written? When does it take place, and how do we look at it from a contemporary point of view in 2012, I guess it is now? And as most of you know, the piece was written in the late 18th century, and then the opera was written in the late 19th century. So what I thought would be kind of interesting was to update it to the time period in which Massenet wrote it, which of course is the height of the Second Industrial Revolution. And the image that I was drawn to, it's funny because when Dale called me to do this piece, I had just seen a documentary about the Golden Gate Bridge. Has anyone seen this? It's very depressing, about suicides on the Golden Gate Bridge, but that is what the opera, ends up. We know it doesn't end well. And the idea of this Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco as a romantic place for suffering poets and figures to go and jump off the bridge. It seems crazy, but over 2,000 people have killed themselves on the Golden Gate Bridge since they started keeping records. And for a while, they would try to commemorate who can be number 2,000. And they would have it on the... No, it's very macabre stuff there. And then at a certain point, the mayor of San Francisco said, stop keeping track of this. It's not... Don't encourage people to come and jump off this bridge. But it was a really kind of interesting documentary about the romance of suicide. Because when Werther was written, there were a lot of copycat suicides throughout Europe. I mean, it was really kind of Goethe was sort of the first literary celebrity in the modern world. I mean, he was the first one to be known internationally, and Werther was his first piece. And everybody was copying Werther at the time, especially young men were all trying to dress like him, the kind of romantic, Lenski-like hero. And then some of them took it a little bit too far and actually went and killed themselves too. So hopefully that won't happen with our audience here. But so the tension between the kind of Industrial Revolution and Werther as a character who loves nature. He sings a lot about nature, about romantic love. And Charlotte, for him, is the ideal woman. She's beautiful. She's a good mother. She represents a potential to be a good wife. She loves nature and poetry and being outside. She dresses very well, especially in this production, too. And so he becomes obsessed with her, and obsessed with this idea of a more old-fashioned love that I think kind of fell by the wayside during the Industrial Revolution, talking in very grand terms. So this idea of a bridge became central to our production because it represents for me both the proliferation of Bessemer steel. They were building bridges and railroads. It was all about industry and mass production and infrastructure. And alongside that, it's also like a central image for suicidal impulses. So for some reason, it seemed like a good place for us to start. And then as soon as I brought this up, Kevin Raymack sent me a picture of the bridge from the production of Grapes of Wrath. And I said, well, perfect. We can use that then. That's great. So the one element from this production that it's been refitted and adapted for Werther, but it's this giant steel structure of a bridge. So it actually worked out perfectly that when we thought of this idea, I didn't realize there was a bridge like this in-house. So it actually not only saved money, but it's perfectly and exactly what we were looking for. So just to kind of talk through a little bit, we have this kind of, we're keeping it in Germany, even though it's in French, we're keeping it in the kind of Weimar-inspired city of German industrialization. And of course, when Massenet wrote this, that's exactly what was happening. Railroads are being built everywhere, bridges. It was all about infrastructure. So the first thing we'll see is Werther's Garret in the prologue. One of my favorite things about the opera is that there's a lot of really beautiful orchestral interludes to introduce scenes and to take us from place to place. I love transitions and finding a vocabulary for the storytelling, even when people aren't singing. And so we'll see Werther already obsessed with this kind of romantic idea of being a poet in love. And there's paper all over. You can't quite see it in this photograph, but throughout his little La Boheme-like garret, there are pieces of paper everywhere. So he's written poetry. He's already spotted Charlotte. I think he already has fallen in love with her a little bit before he meets her. And then in the transition, we see this garret goes upstage and kind of gets swallowed by this industrial backdrop. And then we go to this kind of beautiful pastoral yard for Charlotte here. And I thought it'd be kind of interesting if this whole aria about the beauty of nature, it's kind of like the last tree that hasn't been cut down in industrial Europe. It seems very pessimistic, but this tree also grows magically to fit under the bridge, which I know they're working on right now next door. And so you can see that we have all these upper levels here for Werther to enter. This is a pear tree, so the kids are picking pears. We're going to have croquet on the lawn. So it feels like a very pastoral scene. And this way it takes us into the house. We'll talk more about that in rehearsal. And if you can see this backdrop here, it's all about the building of industry. So it's not just the smokestacks and kind of the industrial landscape, but there are piles of wood here. And they're not making fences anymore. They're making something quite different. So in this version, they come back to the ball, and the kind of last romantic scene of Act 1 takes place with this beautiful tree. And then as we go into Act 2, the tree and the yard go off, and then here we are kind of at the train station. There's several locations they talk about in Act 2. There's a party going on in the church, and this is the Green Grapes German saloon here, and you can see the little sign, the Golden Grapes. And then we actually don't have the train up there anymore, but we still have the train tracks. And then instead what we did is kind of put the stopper for a train that you see in train stations so they don't, go off the tracks, I guess. And I love the way you can see that the wood of the floor goes into the wood of the train tracks, into the pile of wood on the river there. And so the river becomes more present in this scene. We didn't see it before. And again, just in the back of your mind, think about the tragic romance of this industrial bridge overlooking the river. And so all of these scene changes are animated. All of these introductions for each act allow us to change the scene a vista, as we say in opera, right? And then after intermission, we are inside another tree. So as you can see, they're still preserving this idea of nature inside whenever possible. And I think Charlotte and Werther really are in love. She's promised her mother, before her mother died, that she would marry Albert. And why does she marry Albert? Because, frankly, he's rich. He's an upwardly mobile bourgeois railroad magnate in our production, right? So even when he shows up in the first scene, he's bringing presents for the kids and their little toy railroad cars. So he's making all of his money in the railroad industry. So Charlotte has to sort of choose between, we've all been there, right? Romance or security. Yeah. Hopefully you get both, but so here we are, and one of my favorite, this is a very, those of you that know Alan, this is a very Alan Moyer detail. There's a little toy train set going around the tree as well. Now, of course, the 1880s are exciting for a lot of reasons, but directorially and design-wise, one of them is that electricity was basically fairly commonplace then if you had a lot of money and could afford it. So the tree has a candlelight on it, but there's also a sense of electric lights and that we've kind of graduated. So, I should also say that we start Act 3. There's a beautiful percussive interlude at the top of Act 3, and that's where we see Werther on top of the bridge, kind of throwing his letters into the, into the river. So that bridge structure that's up there, as I'm sure you've gathered from these photos, moves up and down. The supers are wearing laborer costumes, so you get a sense of the industry being built throughout the production. So if you imagine that this bridge is all the way down stage, we see Werther pacing back and forth, smoking a cigarette. No, just kidding, no cigarettes. And then he's kind of throwing his, his pages into the river, and then the bridge starts to track back as Charlotte's living room comes forward, right? It's very Broadway. And as the mirror flies in. And of course, Act 3 has that famous kind of Chekhovian moment where he's like, hey, look at these guns. These are cool, right? Chekhov said if you show a gun in the first act, you have to fire it in the fourth. And it's the only, I love this opera, but it's the only problematic thing. He literally says, hey, look at these guns that I used to admire. And then at the end of the act says, I'm going on a trip. Can I borrow your guns? Albert says, yes, take them, right? So here we are in this scene. But I think it's quite beautiful because we'll see them decorating the tree at the beginning, and it will have a very Christmas time feel. And then as we transition into Act 4, of course, this kind of tracks off, the windows fly away, and then we go to Act 4, which is back in the garret that we've already seen before. And now all the pages have been ripped off the wall, and he's scrawled Liebe oder Tod on the back, love or death, yeah? And we've been playing with a couple of different phrases from the original that we could put back there, but we'll see if that's the one that sticks or not. That was sort of the more obvious one, but I think it's poetic. And then we see Charlotte kind of running over this bridge. She's late. She's never been to his house before. She's trying to find it. She comes down these stairs. And then, of course, when she comes in, there's a lot of blood in this model photo, which I know Jessica is very excited about. I think actually already twice today I've heard we have to talk about the blood. It's not even from Jessica, but from everybody else. So, but the great layout of this scene is that when Charlotte comes in, as you can see, the light shines on that wall, so it takes her a while to find him. And then the whole last scene takes place in this garret. So it's very up close and personal. I mean, the majority of this opera are intimate duets and scenes with few people, so it's very, very close and present. And then in one of my favorite moments at the end of this will involve the kids. So we see the kids rehearsing their Christmas songs at the top of the opera in July, which seems a little odd until they explain why they're doing that, to get ready for Christmas 6 months later. So it's going to be snowing on top of that bridge there. And then the very last thing we'll see is the kids coming across that bridge. It says they're singing off stage, but I think it'll be nice to have them on stage for that moment. And so we get this kind of innocent, playful parade of children in the snow above this image below of decidedly innocence lost on the deck level. So that's kind of the basic approach to it. And we'll look for lots of moments for emphasizing this fatalistic idea of Werther and his destiny. So this structure provides many opportunities to see him looking at the view of industry, that he's this whole idea of kind of post-enlightenment, that we're abandoning nature and romance and poetry and picnicking and reading books. And I mean, Werther in this context essentially is reading about himself, if that makes sense. It's almost as though he's reading the Goethe of 100 years before, and he's kind of obsessed with this romantic late 18th century hero. Should we look at some clothes a little bit? Jessica, do you want to come talk about clothes a little bit? Do you guys have any questions about the physical production before we talk about clothing? And those of you that have worked with me before know that my main philosophy is a good idea is a good idea, wherever it comes from. I'm very collaborative, and I want to hear what all of you have been thinking about your roles, and I can't wait to integrate it musically with Maestro and discover it as a group. And there's no chorus in the show, which is kind of nice. It's a really intimate piece. Jessica.
I think that these are probably the ones that are not in color. So just so you know, but it's very pretty. I promise. I think the thing that occurred to me most was the idea of romanticism for this show, and for me, that idea is actually also all about contrast, which I know Maestro talked about as well. But what is romance without the contrast of hard and soft or dark and light? And so I think that also for me was something that helped me fit this into this period of the late 19th century, and also into Germany during the height of industrialism. The idea for me behind this also was to keep this as sort of real as possible, so that we feel like we're watching real people in real tragedy and real happiness, depending on where they are in this opera. And so all of these costumes are not costumey in the best way. So I think that that's something that is very important to me with this particular piece, because I think that also helps move the story forward, and helps all of these characters really come forward themselves as people that the audience can relate to more strongly. And that, again, I think also helps in this period. It's it's sort of a period that we can all relate to in our own history. Usually we have family that we can trace back at least that far. So I think that this late 19th century period for me was a really great way of steeping this story in a place where the audience and the singers and all of us could sort of feel stable and supported. Then the other thing I think that I thought a lot about was the contrast between Charlotte and Werther. And in terms of their relationship and how they both saw each other and how they see themselves, keeping Charlotte sort of very light and, I like to say fluffy, but really it's not fluffy, sort of light and airy. Her colors are all very pastel throughout the show, so that she kind of, to Werther, is this sort of beacon of light. And even in this reality-based production, sort of angelic and ethereal. Whereas Werther, I feel, sort of is, because of his own ideas of what romance are and how he views the world, is sort of steeped in the idea of, which was very popular actually in this period, of the aesthetique, which was sort of artists' idea that the past periods were sort of more viable in terms of romance and artistry than the industrial period that they were in. So for him, we sort of pushed him back, and it's almost like he's wearing vintage. It's like 1880s vintage. So so some of his clothes come from earlier periods to sort of help this idea of him sort of being a little bit on the outskirts of proper society and more in the world of the artist. In contrast to him, then, we have Albert, who, as Kevin said, is sort of, an industrialist and up-and-coming businessman and railroad tycoon. And so we sort of see his transition from a young businessman to sort of a really posh, I have no idea. Oh, he's up there. A really posh, sort of wealthy part of the community. And then the supporting cast characters, I think I sort of, just played around with. Sophie is one of my favorites, I just have to say. Her sort of tomboy-like spirit is actually, interestingly enough, more like Werther, I think, than Charlotte is. And so it's interesting that he sort of brushes her aside, in that when actually I think that they are sort of more artistic and free in their spirit than Carlotta and than Werther are. So we kept her sort of a little bit tomboyish, and she could be playing croquet or ice skating or archery. Yeah, we're going to give her a bow and arrow. And then we have the Bailey, who's sort of, fun and free-spirited and a little weird. As the father, I like weird characters; they're sort of great. The sort of Tweedledee and Tweedledum aspect of Johann and Schmidt, and the children, who are always really fun to do. So it's just kind of a mixture of people that you should feel like are really people that you might know, except set in the late 19th century.
Has everyone read the original? If you haven't, you can borrow my copy. It's a pretty fast read, but it's all written in the form of letters that Werther wrote to his friend Wilhelm. So anyway, he wrote, my grandfather used to tell a story about a magnetic mountain. Ships that sailed too close were suddenly stripped of their ironwork. The nails flew to the mountain, and the wretched travelers perished in the falling timbers. I don't know why, just something about the transition from woods to industry to perishing travelers. I don't know, it seemed to inform this production in a little bit. So anyway, we're all thrilled to be here. We're going to have a great time, and I look forward to getting started. Thanks, everybody.